the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 16th. I want to start off this week with the topic suggested by Jeff regarding polling data on COVID vaccine compliance, hesitancy, desirability, and other issues surrounding continued COVID, quote, vaccination, unquote, compliance in 2024. There are a battery of survey sites that I frequent with some regularity, and I can't recall having seen anything about vaccine compliance or any of the sentiments surrounding continued shots, who needs them, who should get them, whether or not they should be mandated, if they should be covered by insurance. Nothing at all on the topic. And looking back in the archives of the major polling outlets that I follow, I don't see anything from any of them since 2022 or at the latest early 2023. And that corresponds to the amount of attention that the COVIDian complex was receiving. When that dried up, so did the issues surrounding COVID and the push for continual vaccinations. However, that has still been running in the background. The CDC still makes recommendations. The AMA echoes those recommendations. Insurance companies, for the most part, cover COVID vaccinations just like they do flu shots. That is, if they're not offered for free via government subsidy, which is, of course, not free for the proverbial taxpayer or free from the damage that the perpetual undermining of the real purchasing power of the dollar that occurs via inflation. Because it's really not even right to talk about how taxpayers eat the costs. I mean, in some indirect sense they do, because they are effectively, for most regular commercial transactions, forced to use the US dollar, and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury together produce dollars that are funded by massive borrowing from entities other than net taxpayers, net American taxpayers. So it's funded really more through the debasement of the currency than it is through direct taxation. But in any case, these things have been running in the background for the last 2 years, even as COVID and the issues surrounding it have fallen out of the corporate news cycles. And looking into the data I could find, I was surprised at how high full compliance with the suggested vaccination schedule is even into the summer of 2024. And I'm going to censure myself there a little bit. I shouldn't use the term vaccination. I think that words have meanings, and I am instinctively opposed to the definitional revisionism to suit the needs of the current year, as has been done with the word vaccination and what it previously was presumed to refer to and what it now allegedly means. Until quite recently, just in the last couple of years, vaccination meant immunity from whatever was being vaccinated against. Now, what it means, best case scenario, is that it's more like a multivitamin, that it maybe mitigates the most deleterious effects and maybe it retards the spread, but it's not an inoculation against what it is putatively there to prevent. Reading from a Guardian article from a couple weeks ago, quote, only 22.5% of adults and 14.4% of children are up to date on COVID vaccines, and the rate is even lower at 13.3% among pregnant people, despite the risks of severe illness, complications, and long COVID because of COVID infection during pregnancy, unquote. So 22.5, call it 23% of adults, that is, of course, well short of a majority, but it is more than 1 in 5, almost 1 in 4 American adults are staying up to date on their multi-year COVID vaccine regimen. So after the dust had settled, that's not a grand slam for the pharmaceutical companies, but it's a solid double, maybe a triple. 50%, right at 50% of Americans annually receive a flu shot. So to be at nearly a quarter or almost half of the coverage for COVID boosters as exist for flu shots. Well, flu shots provide a very lucrative income stream for the pharmaceutical companies, and it looks like COVID is following a similar trajectory. And of course, the flu has a big head start in terms of how long it's been offered. The flu got a big head start, but this race is more akin to a marathon than a sprint. And while I'm surprised at how high the COVID schedule uptake is at this point in time, it will be significantly higher still if it gets back in the regular news cycle, if it becomes top of mind and the establishment reverts to pushing it again. It's been on the back burner for the last couple of years, running at the oven setting of 1 or 2, but it can be turned up pretty quickly to an 8 or a 10 with an outbreak identified and the corporate media doing what they do and the managerial classes, all of the institutions of power that are staffed by managerial types require it for functionality, to work, to go to school, to travel, to function socially. Those things can happen again if needed. But as aforementioned, the situation as it currently stands is quite remunerative for Big Pharma and for the Congress critters it issues orders to and who hold a sizable percentage of their equity holdings in. Relatedly, there's a thought that's occurred to me that I can't shake and that I feel compelled to give voice to here. And it's conjecture, or more precisely, attempt at auguring the future, with a couple priors in place, namely that the global managerial class does not think highly of the vast hordes of rabble that populate the globe, and that same managerial class thinks that there are far too many people living on Earth. And so within that bounded rationality, I think there is a not insignificant chance the next virus that gets cooked up will be significantly lethal, and that the shot that is rolled out to ameliorate the spread and to protect against this much more lethal, much more damaging virus than what we saw with COVID-19, that shot will actually be quite effective. And it might even be that the marketing is intentionally ham-fisted and unable to stand up to rigorous questioning, that the data underlying it, at least the data that's presented publicly, will be, or at least will appear to be, corrupted or compromised or in some other way inadequate. Small sample sizes, no double blind, no placebos, etc. And that clumsiness, coupled with the slow but steady burn organically in the non-managerial population of resentment and regret and frustration and incredulity regarding the relentless, sustained, coercive campaign to force as many needles into as many arms as possible in 2021 and 2022. That those confluence of factors will create some sort of ceiling on the increase in uptake for the new shot developed to deal with whatever the newest pandemic threat is, whatever the novel coronavirus of 2019 is, or of 2020 is in 2026 or 2028. That it will lead to a situation instead of where we had 80% roughly across the Western world compliance with the shot schedule, the shot regime as it was rolled out for the first year. That instead of 80%, maybe this time around we get 50%. And that 50% will be highly selective in favor of NPCs and in favor of those who have some combination of a total lack of critical thinking skills and contrarian or dissident impulses, and those with a strong natural inclination for conformity and for agreeableness. But as mentioned earlier, this time, the contagion this time around is real. It is deadly. It is everything they attempted to scare the world population into thinking that COVID-19 was. and they have the defense for it, but understandably, a large percentage of the population voluntarily refuses to avail themselves of that pharmaceutical intervention that would prevent the said deadly virus from being deadly. It's a horrifying thought because it's exactly what the WEF types would want. It is a global homo dream to drastically reduce the global population while virtually entirely wiping out the natural, organic, human sources of resistance to those WEF plans for the world. Let me say emphatically that this should not be interpreted as some sort of preemptive endorsement for whatever the next round of mandated or highly suggested pharmaceutical interventions for the next catastrophic, existentially threatening biological menace said to come on the scene presents. Maybe they lack the capacity to create a both highly contagious and highly fatal virus, as those two things tend to work against one another. A virus spreads more easily, of course, if it doesn't kill its hosts, thus isolating it from other places to spread to. Maybe there aren't actually people, at least not concentrations of people in power, who want this to happen. That objection is the least convincing, as there is plenty of such people saying in their own words that this is more or less what they would like to have happen. But maybe that's just locker room talk around their friends when they're frustrated, and that's what manifests from a combination of pretension and misanthropy. Or maybe, I think this is probably the most compelling objection, is that they lack the ability to effectively control the monster once they create it. That a highly contagious, highly deadly pathogen simply can't be adequately controlled by a pharmaceutical intervention, at least not over an extended period of time, because that highly contagious, highly deadly pathogen, when it runs into pharmaceutical intervention obstacles, mutates around those interventions and becomes effectively unstoppable. That it would be for the managerial class like releasing mustard gas into a tornado that they're right in the center of. And that in killing a large share of the world's population, they find that they are no less immune than elites in the Middle Ages were from the Black Plague. Switching topics now, without getting out of the what would derisively be referred to as the conspiratorial weeds, there were some heated words exchanged indirectly between Tucker Carlson, king of the small d dissonant right in America, and its numerically much smaller capital D dissonant right vanguard, manifesting by way of Nick Fuentes, with Tucker Carlson implying that Fuentes is a Fed, and Fuentes firing back that Carlson comes from a CIA family, and that someone who is a close confidant and repeat guest of Tucker Carlson is Eric Prince, who is about as enmeshed in and closely tied to the military-industrial complex as a person can get. This is the guy who ran Blackwater for years during the Iraq occupation. He essentially acted as a mercenary warlord who, in exchange for tens of millions or hundreds of millions or tens of billions of dollars, laundered through the U.S. military to Prince and his organization, did the dirty deeds that the U.S. military didn't want to do or didn't feel for optical reasons it could carry out on its own. We're the American military. We don't assassinate people. We just hire these other mercenaries, these private contractors, to do it for us. All of the Fed talk is kind of silly in that the alphabet agencies, the NSA has all of the communications of anyone who has interacted with Fuentes or Carlson or anyone multiple degrees of separation from those people, because they have the information of all the communications of everyone in the Western world. And just because some agent of the deep state makes that information known to some figure they're looking to manipulate or to even blackmail, like, say, Nick Fuentes, and Fuentes hears what they have to say and responds accordingly in a way that may entirely meet the objectives of the deep state operative or might not or might get part of the way there. Just because a person has interacted with a federal agent doesn't mean that he is, quote, a Fed, unquote, in the sense that he is now a marionette to be utilized by the deep state for whatever nefarious purposes the deep state is up to. A ton of these prominent people, probably all of these prominent voices, especially those in the generally oppositional camp to what the regime in power is currently doing, have been contacted in some way by the feds. After January 6th, Fuentes had his assets frozen and found himself on a no-fly list for commercial flights in the United States. At some point that was lifted. You can guarantee that there was some contact with feds during that drawn-out process. And to reiterate, the question of whether or not he gave information out is kind of a silly one because that information is already there for the taking. As for how much that interaction, consciously or subconsciously, influences how those who are contacted by the feds act in the future, it's hard to say. It's even harder to suss out definitively because human motivations and human actions are complex things that don't really lend themselves well to this sort of direct cause and effect analysis. From the conspiratorial to the more mundane but no less confusing, the Tim Walz pick for vice president at the expense of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro is, from a tactical perspective, a real head-scratcher. Before diving into this at any level of detail, it has to be prefaced that it could simply be that the fix is in, that in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, where the secretaries of state are all pro-managerial, anti-Trump people in conjunction with what will be an unprecedented, that will blow the number from 2020 out of the water, unprecedented number of mail-in ballots that will be cast, and the inherent difficulty in veracity of those votes, the fact that there are urban centers like Detroit and Milwaukee and Philadelphia that are controlled from top to bottom by Democrats. Those were the places where the videos of recount rooms just being totally blocked off from any sort of reporting or recording, where token Republican poll watchers were inexplicably kicked out, or when they left were locked out and not permitted to return, with the existence and no doubt the accretion over the last 4 years of those sorts of centers and the corresponding tactics that allowed them to flourish, with a corresponding total lack of ability, if even desire at all, for the Republican Party, the RNC, the GOP, the Republican Party establishment to even want to push back, to challenge any fraud, no matter how blatant. All of these things added together just might mean that from the get-go that the outcome has already been determined and that there is no way that Trump is permitted to re-enter the White House. But for the sake of trying to offer an analysis on the at least tacit insinuation that said analysis actually matters, because the votes matter and the strategies, the tactics surrounding what the campaigns do matter, the Walz pick is a real head-scratcher. Progressives say this shores up Michigan, the one state in the country where the Arab population could swing the state vote by approaching a single percentage point. And in a state where the margin could be decided by a few tens of thousands of votes, well, less than 1%, that could conceivably make the difference. But the immediate problem I see with that assessment is that Michigan was, prior to Joe Biden dropping out of the race, let alone prior to Harris choosing Walz, the polling showed that Michigan was leaning towards Biden/Harris anyway. But polling has consistently shown Pennsylvania to be very, very marginally leaning towards Trump. As of this recording, the RCP average actually has an exact coin flip, and the most recently included poll by Emerson has Trump up by 1. Pennsylvania is then the most purple of all states, the swingiest of swing states. If the election were to be held now and all of the polling averages held, Trump beats Harris 287 electoral votes to 251 votes if he wins Pennsylvania. However, if Harris wins Pennsylvania, the tightest of tight electoral outcomes emerges, and Harris wins 200 270 to 268. So as things are, and as they have been for the last several weeks, months even, the Republican margin of victory has been the state of Pennsylvania. On the other hand, it's said, and the polling seems to indicate this, that vice presidential candidates don't matter. They provide a very modest bump at announcement, but that modest bump smooths out in the subsequent week or two, and the polling averages return to what they were prior to the VP picks being made known. It's also not implausible that Shapiro, despite wanting to publicly create the perception that he was interested, wasn't actually interested. There's still plenty of benefit to be gained by being one of the names allegedly bandied around as someone who merited serious consideration, because with that comes massive name recognition that is hard to otherwise come by on a national scale. Why do we know the names of the governors of Pennsylvania and Minnesota, but not the names of the governors of Indiana or Wisconsin? It's because the former were considered for being tapped as vice presidential nominees, while the latter have not been. We do, of course, know the name of one recent Indiana governor, Mike Pence, a point that I think rhetorically goes a long way in proving mine. If the decision to skip over an explicitly Zionist Jewish governor of Pennsylvania for an explicitly Zionist, albeit less saliently so, less emphatically so, Gentile in the form of Minnesota Governor Walz, that too is difficult to make electoral tactical sense of. From an Economist YouGov poll that released this week asking about Harris's support of Israel, we see that 13% of respondents say that she has been too supportive of Israel, while 27% say she has not been supportive enough of Israel. So by a 2-to-1 margin, voters say that she has not been supportive enough of Israel rather than being too supportive of Israel. Now, among Democrats, just 3% say she has not been supportive enough of Israel, while 14% say she has been too supportive of Israel, with 44% saying she's been about right in her level of support of Israel and 39% saying they are not sure. Interestingly, though, the poll also asks about vote intent, and we see the results for those who intend to vote for Harris to mirror almost exactly the figures for Democrats. In other words, while about 1 in 6 Democrats say that Harris has been too supportive of Israel and a marginal amount say she has not been supportive enough, it hasn't resulted in any number of Democrats dropping off and refusing to vote for Harris on account of her unduly strong support for Israel. And among independents, 15%, so virtually the same number as among Democrats, say that Harris has been too supportive of Israel, but 22% say she has not been supportive enough. So the plurality position among independents is that Harris has not been supportive enough of Israel. If Harris's perceived pro-Israel bias was hurting her among potential supporters of hers, we would expect to see the percentages for the 2024 vote intent for Harris, the percentages saying that she's too supportive of Israel, to be lower than the percentages of Democrats who say that she's too supportive of Israel, or the percentages of independents who say that she's too supportive of Israel. But that's not what the polls show. And so what that shows is that while there is a minority of voters on the left who have misgivings about Harris's support for Israel and her pro-Zionism more generally, it's not enough to cause any of them to not vote for her. She can take those votes for granted because, of course, they can always take those votes for granted because those votes come from people who are quite status conscious, who are the most consistently vigilant, virtue-signaling contingent of the American electorate. And the idea of being on the wrong side of history by going against the inner party and against the forces that are on the cultural ascendancy and horrors of horrors, even potentially being culpable of returning Donald Trump to a second term in the White House, all of that's totally unbearable for those people. So they are going to vote for Harris Walz. They would have voted for Harris Shapiro. They're going to vote for anyone with a D next to the name because he or she's not Donald Trump. As for the authentic America Firsters on the right who are opposed to America's bankrolling and shepherding and safeguarding perceived Israeli interests in the U.S., it's a small club. Among Republican respondents, just 7% say that Trump has been too supportive of Israel, while 3% say he has not been supportive enough of Israel, and 66% say his support of Israel has been about right, with the residual 24% saying not sure. So the idea that there's some bastion of non-interventionist sentiment on the grassroots right is mistaken. It does exist, that contingent does exist, but it's quite small, and it has no voice among Republicans of any stature, of any influence. We'll end this week looking at another YouGov poll, this one involving corporate censorship, internal censorship, so that is the way that the corporations regulate their own content or the content that's created on their sites, which effectively they do own. But it's a private company, so of course they can do whatever they want. They are, in reality, heavily subsidized and also heavily regulated by the state. The idea that their censorship decisions internally are somehow independent of outside state actors should have always been perceived to be naively absurd. But with the release of the Twitter files, it no longer had to be perceived that way. It was explicitly laid bare that that is the case, that there is massive manipulation and coercion coming from state actors on these putatively private corporations. That's not of greatest interest to me. Fine semantical differences can be whatever they are, just like the law can be written to be whatever it is. But what matters is what is enforced and what isn't. Elite discretion, you might call it, and the corresponding public sentiment that runs with it or runs counter to it. And that, in truth, doesn't seem to matter very much either. But to once again avoid repeating over and over that nothing matters, let's look at the data in a little bit of detail. The question posed here is, quote, in general, do you think the way that most major social media platforms regulate the content posted to their sites is, unquote, and there are 4 options, too strict, not strict enough, about right, and not sure. Overall, 18% say too strict, 37% say not strict enough, with the residuals being 22% about right and 23% not sure. So by 2-to-1, Americans say that social media platforms don't regulate content strictly enough. Whatever the legal status of free speech in the United States is, the spirit of free speech in America is dying. And it's primarily Democrats who are killing it. We'll look at sexual and racial and generational differences in a second, but by far the most pronounced differences are by partisan affiliation. Just 9% of Democrats say the way that social media platforms regulate content posted to their site is too strict, while 49% say not restrictive enough. And so by a more than 5-to-1 margin, Democrats say that online platforms should censor more. Among independents, it's 33% saying not strict enough compared to 19% saying too strict. So by not quite 2-to-1, independents think that there isn't enough censorship going on, and Republicans are split exactly evenly at 28% saying too strict and 28% saying not strict enough. So if Democrats are killing free speech, Republicans are doing nothing to stop it from being murdered. A pattern we see repeated time and time again on issue after issue. By race, 20% of whites say it's too strict, 38% not strict enough. So 2-to-1, whites say that there should be more censorship on social media. Among blacks, it's 37% saying not strict enough to 11% saying too strict. So that's by a more than 3-to-1 margin. Blacks say that there should be more censorship. Hispanics, 30% not strict enough to 16% saying too strict. So again, almost exactly the same as whites, 2-to-1 in favor of more censorship. And others, which in this case primarily refers to American Indians and Asians or Pacific Islanders, it's 37% saying not strict enough to 19% saying too strict. So whites, Hispanics, and others, by about 2-1 want more censorship. Blacks 3-1 want more censorship. By sex, 24% of men say that censorship is too strict, while 34% say not strict enough. So by about a 3-2 margin, men want more censorship. Women, 39% say censorship is not strict enough, while 13% say it's too strict. So in the case of women, it's a perfect 3-1 in favor of censorship. While it's debatable as to whether or not women are the fairer sex, they are certainly the more censorious sex. And finally, by generational cohort, if there is any optimism for free speech absolutists or those who tend in the direction of unregulated speech, younger Americans are a bit less censorious than their elders are. Among Zoomers, 18% say too strict, to 31% not strict enough. Among millennials, 17% say too strict, 38% not strict enough. Among Xers, 20% say too strict, 37% not strict enough. And among boomers, 19% too strict, 40% not strict enough. And so in the case of boomers, by more than a 2-1 margin, they favor more censorship, whereas among Zoomers, it's a little bit better at about 3-2 in favor of more censorship. When they were young, they were all about questioning authority. Now that they are the authority, or at least they perceive themselves still to be the authority, although morally and culturally that authority is slipping rapidly away from white boomers to the emerging rainbow coalition of new Americans, well, now they don't want that authority questioned quite so much. All right, that'll do it for us today. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.